It started as a trip meant to clear my mind. I was going through a rough patch, work stress, a breakup, you name it. The Appalachian Trail seemed like the perfect escape. Hundreds of miles of wilderness to lose myself in, to reconnect with something real. I packed light, just enough to last a week, and drove to a popular starting point in Georgia. The forest greeted me like an old friend, the whisper of leaves and the crunch of dirt beneath my boots, promising solitude and peace. For the first 3 days, everything went as planned. The trail was challenging but rewarding. I passed a few hikers here and there, shared brief nods, and even camped near a couple one night. On the 4th day, I decided to take a less traveled spur trail. It wasn't marked on most maps, but an older hiker had mentioned it as a beautiful detour with fewer people. That was exactly what I wanted. I should have listened to my gut when I reached the entrance to that spur trail. The sign was old and weathered, barely legible, and the path itself was narrow, overgrown, but I pressed on, drawn by the promise of solitude. The first few hours were peaceful, almost idyllic. I saw deer darting through the underbrush and heard the calls of birds I couldn't identify. But as the sun dipped lower in the sky, a sense of unease began to creep in. The forest grew unnaturally quiet. The birdsong faded, replaced by the rustle of leaves that seemed off, like something moving just out of sight. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was just tired. I found a small clearing to set up camp and lit a fire. The dancing flames pushed back the darkness, and I tried to shake off the feeling of being watched. I even laughed at myself, convincing myself I was just spooked by the isolation. But then, as I sat by the fire eating my dinner, I heard it. A low, guttural laugh, distant but unmistakable. My blood ran cold. I froze, straining my ears. But the sound didn't come again. I told myself it was an animal, maybe some odd bird call or the wind playing tricks on me. I didn't sleep well that night. Every snap of a twig, every whisper of the wind set my heart racing. The next day I pushed on, determined to shake the unease. The trail grew rougher, less defined, but I didn't want to turn back yet. By midday I noticed something strange. Scattered along the trail were small objects. A child's shoe, a rusted tin cup, a cracked porcelain doll's head. They looked old, weathered, but their presence was unsettling. Why were these things out here, miles from any road or settlement? I told myself they were remnants of some old campsite or homestead, but deep down I didn't believe it. The feeling of being watched grew stronger. Oppressive. Shadows in the trees seemed to flicker in the corner of my eye, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. That night, I didn't bother with a fire. I set up my tent quickly and climbed inside, hoping the nylon walls would make me feel safe. They didn't. As darkness fell, I heard footsteps. Not animal sounds, human footsteps, deliberate and heavy, circling my camp. I held my breath, clutching the small knife I carried for emergencies. The steps came closer, pausing just outside my tent. I could hear my own heartbeat, loud and frantic, as if it would give me away. And then the laughter came again, louder this time, deeper, more menacing. It was no animal. It was no trick of the wind. It was a person, or something trying very hard to sound like one. My body was frozen, every muscle locked in place. I don't know how long I lay there, waiting for the footsteps or the laughter to come back, but they didn't. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a fitful sleep. The next morning, I found footprints around my tent. Barefoot, human, but wrong. The toes were too long, the heel too narrow. I packed up quickly and decided to head back the way I came, abandoning any hope of finishing the trail. But the way back felt different, like the forest itself was shifting, leading me deeper instead of letting me leave. By midday, I was completely lost. The trail markers I'd relied on were gone, replaced by unfamiliar trees and thickets. I came across more objects, an old pocket watch, a shattered mirror, a child's toy car. Each one felt like a breadcrumb, left for me to follow, though I didn't know by whom or what. As night fell again, I found myself in another clearing. Exhausted, I set up camp, though every instinct screamed at me to keep moving. That's when I saw it. In the distance, just beyond the edge of my camp, there was a figure. Tall and thin, its silhouette barely distinguishable from the trees. It stood perfectly still, watching. I called out, my voice cracking. "Hello? Who's there?" No response. It didn't move, didn't flinch, just watched. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just a tree, a trick of the light. But as I climbed into my tent, I saw it again, closer this time, its shape more defined. It wasn't a tree. I didn't sleep that night. I sat with my knife clutched in my hand. eyes fixed on the shadow outside my tent. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke to the sound of my tent zipper being pulled. Slowly, deliberately. I screamed, lunging forward with the knife, but when I burst out of the tent, there was nothing there. No figure, no footprints, just the sound of the wind in the trees and my own ragged breathing. I don't know how I made it out. The next day, I stumbled through the forest, delirious with exhaustion and fear, until I found a main trail again. A group of hikers saw me and called for help. They said I looked like I hadn't slept in days, like I'd seen a ghost. I don't go hiking anymore. I can't. Even now in the safety of my home, I sometimes hear that laughter in the middle of the night, faint but unmistakable. And when I do, I wonder if I ever really escaped.
Story number 2.
I wasn't supposed to be on the trail that night. My boyfriend Evan and I had planned a short hike on the Appalachian Trail, just a couple of miles to see the fall foliage before heading back to the cabin we rented. But we lost track of time. The sunset came faster than we expected, and soon the trail was bathed in shadow. "Let's keep going," Evan said, pulling out his flashlight. "The parking lot isn't that far." I hesitated. The trail felt different in the dark, more alive, somehow. The towering trees leaned in like silent spectators, and the rustling leaves sounded too deliberate, like whispers. But I didn't want to seem like a coward, so I nodded and followed him. We hadn't gone more than half a mile when the flashlight started to flicker. "Great," Evan muttered, smacking it. "Didn't you bring a spare?" I asked, trying to keep the nervousness out of my voice. He shook his head. "It's fine. We'll make it." The light sputtered again, then died completely, plunging us into near-total darkness. The only light came from the faint glow of the moon filtering through the trees. "Stay close," Evan said, his voice tight. We walked in silence, the sounds of the forest amplifying every step we took. I thought I heard footsteps behind us, but when I turned, there was nothing there, just the trees and shadows. Then we heard it, a low, mournful whistle, carried on the wind. It didn't sound like a bird or any animal I'd ever heard. It was human, or almost human. "What the hell was that?" I whispered. Evan didn't answer. He just grabbed my hand and quickened his pace. The whistle came again, closer this time. It was joined by another sound, soft, shuffling footsteps, like something dragging itself through the underbrush. "Evan." I tugged on his arm, my heart hammering. "Don't stop," he said. "We're almost there." But we weren't. The trail seemed to stretch endlessly, twisting and turning in ways I didn't remember. The shuffling grew louder, accompanied by a strange wet sound, like something slick scraping against the ground. I couldn't help it. I turned around. There was a figure just at the edge of the trail. It was hunched over, its limbs too long, its movements jerky, unnatural. The moonlight caught its face, or what I thought was a face. There were no eyes, just deep, empty sockets that seemed to drink in the darkness. Its mouth was wide, too wide, filled with jagged teeth that gleamed in the dim light. I screamed, yanking Evan's arm. "Run!" We bolted, the adrenaline drowning out everything else. The footsteps behind us turned into a gallop, the thing closing the distance impossibly fast. My lungs burned, my legs felt like they would give out, but I didn't stop. Then Evan tripped. I heard him hit the ground hard, the air forced out of his lungs with a sickening thud. I skidded to a stop, torn between helping him and running. "Go!" he shouted, but his voice was cut off by a strangled cry. I turned just in time to see the thing pounce on him, its limbs folding and unfolding in ways that made my stomach churn. Its mouth stretched impossibly wide as it latched onto him. I don't remember much after that. I ran, blindly, through the forest. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to get away. I could still hear Evan's screams echoing in my ears, followed by the wet, tearing sound of flesh. Somehow, I made it back to the parking lot. My car was the only one there. I drove to the nearest ranger station, barely able to speak through my sobs. When the rangers went back to the trail the next day, they found nothing. No blood, no sign of Evan, not even footprints. They said he must have fallen, gotten lost in the woods. But I know what I saw. I know what took him. And sometimes, late at night, I hear that whistle again, soft and mournful, just outside my window.
Story number 3.
I used to love the Appalachian Trail. I'd hiked sections of it dozens of times, and it always felt like coming home. But after what happened last year, I'll never step foot there again. It was late October, the perfect time to hike. The air was crisp, the leaves were a riot of red and gold, and the crowds had thinned out. I decided to take a weekend trip to a less popular stretch of the trail in Virginia. It was supposed to be a solo trip, a chance to clear my head after a rough few months. The first day was uneventful. I made good time, set up camp near a bubbling creek, and spent the evening staring at the stars. It was peaceful, almost magical. But that night, I woke up to the sound of something scratching at my tent. It wasn't loud, just a faint rhythmic scraping like fingernails on fabric. I froze, my heart pounding. Bears were a possibility out here, but this didn't sound like a bear. It was too deliberate. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent just enough to shine the beam outside. Nothing. Just the trees swaying in the breeze. I told myself it was a branch or a squirrel and tried to go back to sleep. The next day, I felt uneasy, but pushed on. By mid-afternoon, I noticed something strange. Carvings on the trees along the trail. They were crude, almost childlike. They gave me chills. Spirals, stick figures, symbols I didn't recognize. They grew more frequent the farther I went. I thought about turning back, but pride kept me moving. I didn't want to admit I was scared. That evening, I found another clearing and set up camp. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, though I hadn't seen another person all day. As night fell, the forest grew oppressively silent. No crickets, no owls, just nothing. And then I heard it. A voice, faint and distant, calling my name. At first, I thought I was imagining things, but it came again, closer this time. Emily. It was a man's voice, low and raspy, but I couldn't place it. No one knew I was out here. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the darkness, but the beam barely penetrated the thick trees. The voice came again, from a different direction. Emily, come here. I shouted back, demanding to know who it was, but there was no response, just laughter, soft and hollow, echoing through the woods. I didn't sleep that night. I sat with my knife in one hand and my flashlight in the other, jumping at every sound. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke to the sound of footsteps outside my tent. Not heavy, like boots. Light, almost playful, circling me. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tense. The footsteps stopped, and then something pressed against the tent wall. Something cold and damp, like a hand. I screamed and slashed at it with my knife. Whatever it was let out a shriek, high-pitched and inhuman, and vanished. I didn't wait to see what it was. I grabbed my pack and ran, leaving my tent and gear behind. The trail felt wrong, like it was twisting and turning in ways it shouldn't. I stumbled through the darkness, branches clawing at my clothes and face. The voice followed me, growing louder, more insistent. Emily, don't leave. By the time the sun rose, I was completely lost. My legs ached, my throat was raw, and my flashlight was dead. I found myself in a clearing I didn't recognize, surrounded by more of those carved symbols. In the center of the clearing was a cairn, a small pile of stones. Something compelled me to approach it. I didn't want to, but my feet moved on their own. As I got closer, I saw that the stones weren't just stones. They were covered in dried blood, and something was buried beneath them. Before I could stop myself, I reached out and touched the cairn. A wave of cold shot through me, and the voice came again, right behind me this time. Thank you for coming back. I screamed and ran. I don't remember how I found the main trail again, but I did. A group of day hikers found me hours later, disheveled and babbling about voices and symbols. They called for help, and I was taken to a hospital. The rangers went to retrieve my gear, but said they couldn't find the clearing or the cairn. They chalked it up to stress, dehydration, and an overactive imagination. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. Sometimes I wonder if the trail still calls my name, waiting for me to come back.
Story number 4.
I wasn't planning to hike the Appalachian Trail that day, let alone at dusk. My friends and I were road tripping through the Smokies, and a detour landed us near a lesser-known access point. One of my friends, Tom, had heard of a short trail that led to a scenic overlook. It was supposed to be a quick in-and-out hike. No big deal. We set out as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows over the forest. The trail was narrow, winding, and eerily quiet. We joked at first, laughing about how the woods felt like a horror movie setting. But as the light faded, the laughter died. Something about the forest felt wrong. We reached the overlook, a jagged rock outcrop with a stunning view of the valley below, just as the last light of the day disappeared. We took a few pictures and sat in silence, enjoying the moment. That's when we heard the singing. It was faint at first, barely audible over the rustling leaves. A woman's voice, high and lilting, singing a melody that was hauntingly beautiful. None of us spoke, frozen as we strained to hear the words. But there weren't any, just the melody, rising and falling like the wind. "Who the hell is out here singing?" Tom whispered, his voice shaky. I shrugged, uneasy. There were no lights in the distance, no other hikers we'd passed on the trail. It didn't make sense. The singing grew louder, closer. The hairs on my arms stood on end. "Let's get out of here," I said, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. We started back down the trail, moving quickly but carefully in the dark. The singing didn't stop. It seemed to follow us, growing louder, more insistent. I glanced behind me, half expecting to see someone or something emerging from the trees. Then we saw the lights, dim, flickering, like candle flames bobbing in the distance. They hovered in the forest, moving slowly, weaving between the trees. At first, we thought it might be other hikers with lanterns, but the way they moved was unnatural, too smooth, too precise. "What the hell is that?" Tom muttered. "Don't look," one of my other friends, Jess, said suddenly. Her voice was tight, almost panicked. "Just keep walking." "Why?" I asked, my pulse racing. Jess shook her head, her face pale in the dim light. "My grandma used to tell stories about lights like that. They're bad luck. They lead you off the path." We didn't argue. We picked up the pace, our breaths coming in ragged gasps as the singing grew louder. The melody shifted, turning discordant, wrong, like a music box winding down. The lights, now unmistakably closer, seemed to pulse with the music. Then we heard footsteps behind us. Heavy, deliberate, crunching the leaves in a slow, methodical rhythm. "Run!" Tom yelled, breaking into a sprint. We didn't need to be told twice. We ran, the trail blurring in the dark as branches whipped at our faces and legs. The singing and the footsteps followed, relentless. I could feel the lights behind us, their glow seeping through the trees, casting twisted shadows on the ground. Somewhere along the way, Jess tripped. I stopped, grabbing her arm and pulling her up, but in that moment I looked back. I wish I hadn't. The lights weren't lanterns, they weren't fireflies or anything natural, they were eyes. Dozens of them, glowing and floating, attached to no bodies I could see. And in the middle of them was a figure, a woman, or something pretending to be a woman. Her face was pale, almost translucent, and her mouth was open wide, far too wide, pouring out that awful, dissonant song. She didn't have feet. She floated just above the ground, her long hair drifting around her like smoke. I screamed, yanking Jess to her feet, and we ran harder than I thought possible. I don't remember much after that. The next thing I knew, we burst out onto the road, nearly collapsing in front of our car. The singing had stopped. The lights were gone. But the silence of the forest felt heavier than ever, oppressive, as if it were holding its breath. We didn't talk on the drive back to the cabin. We didn't sleep that night, either. The next morning, Tom suggested we check the trail again to prove it was just our imaginations. Jess and I refused. Later, I looked up stories about the area. I found old legends about a ghost woman who lured travelers off the trail with her song, leading them into the forest where they were never seen again. I haven't been on the Appalachian Trail since, but sometimes when the wind is just right, I swear I can hear that melody, faint and far away, calling me back.
Story number 5.
I never considered myself superstitious. Ghost stories were fun, sure, but I didn't believe in them. That changed the night I hiked a remote section of the Appalachian Trail in North Carolina. I'd been on the trail for days, moving at a steady pace and feeling pretty good about my progress. By the 5th evening, I was ahead of schedule and decided to push on a little further to a campsite listed in my guidebook. It was marked as Wolf's Hollow, which sounded ominous but intriguing. The trail to the site was rugged, winding through dense woods that blocked out the evening light. By the time I reached the hollow, the sun had completely set, and the forest was shrouded in darkness. I set up my tent quickly, grateful for the quiet. But the quiet didn't last long. As I cooked my dinner, I noticed the first sign that something was off. The forest had gone completely silent. No insects, no birds, no rustling leaves, just nothing. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath. I tried to ignore it, chalking it up to my imagination. But then I heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping sound. It echoed through the hollow, distant but deliberate. I froze, listening. The tapping grew louder, closer, like something was moving toward me. It wasn't the sound of an animal. It was too regular, too controlled. It reminded me of footsteps, but wrong, like someone walking with heavy wooden legs. I shone my flashlight into the trees, but the beam barely cut through the darkness. The sound stopped. My heart pounded in the silence. I told myself it was just a branch falling or some natural noise. I tried to convince myself to eat, to calm down. Then from the corner of my eye, I saw movement, a shadow darting between the trees, quick and unnatural. I turned the flashlight toward it, but there was nothing there. just trees and darkness. The tapping started again, louder this time, and with it came another sound, a low, guttural growl that sent chills racing down my spine. It didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard, and it was close, too close. I grabbed my knife and stood, scanning the woods with my flashlight. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was a tree. It was tall and thin, its limbs twisted and gnarled like branches. But then it moved. Its head, or what I assumed was its head, tilted toward me, revealing hollow sockets where its eyes should have been. Its mouth opened, wide and jagged, as if it was splitting apart, and from it came that terrible growl. I didn't wait to see what it would do. I grabbed my pack and ran, leaving my tent and everything else behind. I stumbled through the darkness, branches tearing at my clothes and skin. The tapping followed me, relentless, along with the growl that seemed to echo from every direction. I ran until my lungs burned, until my legs gave out, collapsing onto the main trail. The sound stopped. The forest was silent again, but it felt different, less oppressive, like I'd crossed some invisible boundary. I didn't dare look back. When the sun rose, I retraced my steps to retrieve my gear. I found the clearing, but my tent was shredded, torn to ribbons as if by claws. My guidebook was lying open nearby, the page with Wolf's Hollow smeared with dirt, as though someone or something had dragged its fingers across it. I left the trail that day and haven't been back since. I don't know what I saw that night, but I've read enough now to understand the warnings about certain places on the Appalachian Trail. They say there are spots where the forest doesn't want you, where it will do anything to push you out or pull you in. Sometimes I wake in the middle of the night to the sound of tapping outside my window. I don't dare look. I just pray it doesn't find a way inside.
Story number 6.
It was supposed to be a weekend getaway, just me and a few friends, hiking a quiet stretch of the Appalachian Trail in West Virginia. We wanted to escape the noise of the city, to reconnect with nature. But what we found there wasn't nature. It was something else. The first day went smoothly. We covered 10 miles, set up camp by a stream, and laughed around the fire until late into the night. The forest was alive with the sounds of crickets and owls, a symphony of life that lulled us to sleep. On the second day, we came across an old, overgrown path branching off the main trail. It wasn't marked on our map, but there was a wooden signpost, weathered and unreadable, pointing into the trees. "We should check it out," Adam suggested, ever the adventurous one. "I don't know," I said. "It's not on the map. Could be private property." "Come on," Sarah chimed in. "What's the worst that could happen?" Against my better judgment, I agreed. The path was narrow and uneven, winding through dense forest that seemed darker and quieter than the rest of the trail. After about an hour, we emerged into a clearing. At its center was a single massive oak tree, its branches twisted and gnarled like arthritic fingers. Hanging from those branches were dozens of small, crudely made dolls, swaying gently in the breeze. "What the hell is this?" I whispered. The dolls were made of sticks and cloth, their heads carved from chunks of wood. They looked handmade, primitive, and unsettling. Some had faces scratched into them, others had no faces at all. "This is creepy," Sarah said, stepping closer to one of the dolls. "Don't touch them," Adam warned, his voice uncharacteristically serious. We stood there in uneasy silence, the forest around us eerily still. Then we heard it, a low, deep humming, like a chant, coming from somewhere beyond the clearing. "Someone's here," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "We should go," I said quickly, already backing toward the trail. But as we turned to leave, we saw them, figures emerging from the trees. They were cloaked in shadow, their faces obscured by the hoods of ragged cloaks. There were at least 6 of them, maybe more, moving slowly but deliberately, their heads tilting unnaturally as they watched us. "Run," Adam said, and we didn't hesitate. We bolted back down the overgrown path, the sound of the humming growing louder, almost deafening. The figures didn't chase us, but I could feel their eyes on my back, cold and burning at the same time. When we finally reached the main trail, we didn't stop running. By the time we made it to the next campsite, the sun was setting. We didn't talk about what we'd seen. We didn't talk much at all, actually. We just set up camp and tried to act normal. But that night, none of us slept. Around midnight, the humming started again. It was faint, distant, but unmistakable. I sat up in my tent, my heart pounding. Then came the laughter. It was high-pitched, childlike, and it circled our camp, moving from one side to the other. I clutched my flashlight, too scared to move as the laughter grew louder and more erratic. I wasn't the first to scream. That was Sarah. I unzipped my tent to see her standing in the middle of the camp, pointing toward the trees. "They're here!" she cried, and they were. The hooded figures stood at the edge of the firelight, unmoving. In their hands were the dolls from the clearing, the same dolls that had been hanging from the tree. But now the dolls weren't lifeless. They twitched and writhed as if alive, their limbs jerking in unnatural spasms. Adam grabbed Sarah, pulling her back toward the tents. "We have to go," he shouted. We didn't even pack. We just grabbed what we could and ran, abandoning the campsite and heading for the nearest road. The figures didn't follow us, but the laughter did, echoing through the trees, growing fainter as we ran. By the time we reached the road, the sun was rising. We flagged down a car and got out of there, never looking back. A few weeks later, I tried to find that section of the trail on a map. It wasn't there. No overgrown path, no clearing, no old oak tree. Sometimes when I'm alone at night, I hear that laughter again, faint and distant, and I swear if I close my eyes, I can feel the dolls watching me.
Story number 7.
I grew up hearing tales about the Appalachian Trail, stories of ghosts, strange creatures, and unexplained disappearances. My grandparents used to warn me, the mountains are older than time, and not everything up there is meant to be understood. I thought they were just spinning yarns to scare me, until last fall. I was hiking a remote section of the trail in Georgia, just me and my dog, Scout. I'd been looking forward to this trip for months, a chance to disconnect, breathe the mountain air, and spend some time in nature. The first few days were everything I hoped for. The trail was quiet, the weather perfect, and Scout was loving the adventure. On the third day, I decided to push further than planned, hoping to reach a spot marked on my map as Raven's Ridge. It was supposed to have incredible views and a flat clearing for camping. But as the sun dipped lower in the sky, the trail became harder to follow. Overgrown brush obscured the path, and I kept having to stop and double-check my map. By the time I reached the ridge, the sun had set, and the forest was steeped in shadows. The clearing was there as promised, but something about it felt wrong. The trees around the edge of the clearing were ancient, their twisted trunks gnarled like arthritic fingers. The air was colder here, sharp and biting. Scout growled low in his throat as I set up the tent. He rarely growled. He was a sweet, friendly dog, but his hackles were raised, and he kept staring into the dark forest. I tried to calm him down, brushing it off as him reacting to wildlife. That night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps outside the tent. Slow, deliberate, circling. My heart pounded as I reached for my flashlight and unzipped the tent just enough to shine the beam outside. Nothing. Just trees and darkness. Scout was on high alert, his teeth bared, growling low and steady. The footsteps stopped, replaced by a soft rustling sound, like dry leaves being dragged across the ground. Then I heard it, a whisper. At first I thought it was the wind, but it grew louder, more distinct. Words I couldn't understand, spoken in a language I didn't recognize. It sounded old, ancient, like the voice of the forest itself. I stayed awake the rest of the night, clutching Scout close, my knife in one hand and flashlight in the other. When dawn finally broke, the clearing looked different. The grass was flattened in strange, swirling patterns, and there were footprints leading in and out of the forest, large, bare footprints, far too big to be human. I packed up as quickly as I could, eager to get off the ridge. But the trail I had come up on was gone. In its place was dense underbrush, thick and impenetrable. My map was useless. I had no choice but to follow a faint deer path that seemed to lead downhill. Scout and I walked for hours, the forest growing darker and more oppressive with each step. I started to hear things. Whispers in the trees, faint laughter, the rustling of unseen things moving through the brush. Scout whimpered, staying close to my side, his usual energy replaced by a fearful tension. Then I saw it, a figure standing in the distance, partially obscured by the trees. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that seemed too long and a face that was blurred, like looking through frosted glass. It didn't move, but I felt its gaze, heavy and cold. I backed away slowly, pulling Scout with me, and the figure tilted its head, as if curious. Then it raised an arm, long and thin with fingers like tree branches, and pointed. I didn't wait to see what it was pointing at. I ran, dragging Scout with me, crashing through the underbrush, not caring where I was going as long as it was away. The whispers and laughter followed, growing louder, mocking. At some point, I stumbled into another clearing. This one was smaller, with a ring of stones in the center, blackened as if from fire. Symbols were carved into the stones, symbols that hurt my eyes to look at. Before I could react, Scout barked sharply, drawing my attention to the edge of the clearing. The figure was there, standing just beyond the tree line, watching. Its head tilted again, and it took a step forward. I screamed, grabbed a rock from the ground, and hurled it toward the figure. It didn't flinch. Instead, it raised both arms, and the air around me grew heavy, suffocating. My vision blurred, and the forest seemed to spin. Then, just as suddenly, it was gone. The air cleared, and the whispers stopped. Scout and I stood there, trembling, until I noticed a new path had appeared, leading out of the clearing. I didn't question it. I followed the path, running until I burst out onto a gravel road where a passing car stopped to help me. I never found that section of the trail on any map. Rangers told me I must have gotten lost and stumbled into an old campsite or logging site. But I know what I saw, and sometimes when I'm alone at night, I feel that gaze again. Watching. Waiting.
Story number 8.
It started as a simple idea. A night hike. My friends and I thought it would be a thrilling adventure, something to break up the monotony of our usual Appalachian Trail outings. There were 4 of us. Me, Jack, Liz, and Caroline, armed with flashlights, snacks, and an unwarranted sense of bravery. The plan was to hike a section of the trail in Tennessee known as the Devil's Staircase. It had a reputation for being challenging, but we'd heard rumors of strange happenings there. Lights that danced in the woods, voices that called your name when no one was around. Naturally, Jack couldn't resist. We set out around dusk. At first, it was exhilarating. The fading sunlight cast long shadows across the trail, and the forest came alive with the sounds of crickets and owls. The air was cool, and the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze was oddly comforting. By the time darkness fully set in, we were deep into the woods. The trail narrowed, and the trees seemed to close in around us. Our flashlights created small bubbles of light, but beyond that, the forest was pitch black. That's when the silence began. It was subtle at first, an absence of crickets, a sudden stillness in the air. "Do you hear that?" Liz whispered, her voice trembling. "No," Caroline said, her flashlight darting nervously over the trees. "I don't hear anything." "Exactly." We laughed it off, pretending it was just nature doing its thing. But the unease lingered, a quiet tension growing among us. Then we heard it, a faint sound like footsteps coming from the trail behind us. We stopped, turning as one, our flashlights scanning the empty path. "Probably an animal," Jack said, though his voice lacked conviction. We kept walking, picking up the pace. The footsteps followed, staying just far enough behind that we couldn't see anything when we looked back. Caroline started muttering prayers under her breath, while Liz clutched my arm so tightly it hurt. Then came the laughter. It started as a low chuckle, barely audible, but it grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't joyous or playful. It was cold, mocking, and it seemed to come from all around us. Jack spun in a circle, his flashlight flickering, but there was no one there. "We need to go back," Liz said, her voice breaking. "We're too far in," Jack argued. "We're closer to the next trailhead." That's when Caroline screamed. We turned to see her flashlight illuminating a figure standing in the trees, just off the trail. It was pale, almost translucent, with hollow eyes that glowed faintly in the dark. It wasn't moving, but its head was cocked at an unnatural angle, as if it were studying us. We ran. The trail became a blur of roots and rocks as we stumbled and tripped our way forward. The laughter followed us, joined by whispers that grew louder with every step. The figure appeared again and again, always ahead of us, always watching. At one point, Jack stopped, clutching his chest. "I can't breathe," he gasped. We had no choice but to drag him along, his flashlight falling from his hand and disappearing into the underbrush. When we finally burst out onto the trailhead, the laughter stopped. The forest was silent again, but the damage was done. Jack was pale, his hands shaking uncontrollably. Caroline refused to speak, and Liz was crying softly. We drove home in silence, too shaken to process what had happened. None of us ever spoke of that night again, but we all changed in subtle ways. Caroline moved away, Liz stopped hiking altogether, and Jack wasn't the same. He developed a habit of looking over his shoulder, even in broad daylight, and he always left the lights on at night. As for me, I still hike, but never at night. And sometimes when I'm on the trail alone, I feel it, that faint, mocking laughter, just on the edge of hearing.
Story number 9.
It was supposed to be the adventure of a lifetime. My friends and I had always wanted to hike the Appalachian Trail, and finally, we found the perfect weekend to do it. The crisp October air made the idea of hiking through the dense Appalachian woods even more enticing. The trail's reputation for beauty and serenity was exactly what we needed to escape our stressful city lives. We started at sunrise, the trailhead bathed in a golden light that made the world look like something out of a fairy tale. The laughter was easy, the backpacks heavy but manageable, and the thought of ghost stories around a campfire later that night added a thrill to our steps. But something about the forest felt different as the day wore on. The cheerful bird songs and rustling leaves gave way to an eerie stillness. By the time we reached the first campsite, a subtle unease had crept over me. The others didn't seem to notice, and I didn't want to be the one to ruin the mood. We set up camp near a small clearing, and as the sun dipped below the horizon, the trees cast long, skeletal shadows. The fire crackled and danced, its warmth a comforting barrier against the encroaching dark. Naturally, the ghost stories began. We took turns telling tales we'd heard or half remembered from childhood, each one trying to outdo the last. But when it was my turn, I couldn't bring myself to speak. Something deep inside warned me that acknowledging the supernatural in these woods might draw its attention. The others laughed at my hesitance, brushing it off as nerves. We eventually settled into our tents, the fire's glow dying down to embers. Sleep should have come easily after the day's exhaustion, but I lay awake, listening. There was something wrong. It wasn't the usual sounds of the forest, no crickets, no owls, just an oppressive silence that seemed to press against my ears. Then I heard it, a faint rustling like someone or something walking just beyond the edge of the camp. I froze, straining to hear over the pounding of my heart. The sound grew louder, circling us. It wasn't an animal. The footsteps were deliberate, heavy. I glanced at my tent mate, but they were sound asleep. "Hello?" I called out softly, my voice trembling. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but the deafening silence. Then, a whisper. It was faint, barely more than a breath, but it chilled me to the bone. "Leave." I bolted upright, my flashlight fumbling in my hands. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing. Just the dense wall of trees, their twisted branches clawing at the night sky. But the feeling of being watched was undeniable. The next morning, I told the others what I'd heard. They laughed it off, attributing it to my overactive imagination and the spooky atmosphere of the woods. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following us. As we hiked deeper into the trail, the feeling grew stronger. Shadows seemed to dart between the trees, just out of sight. Strange markings appeared on the trees, symbols carved into the bark that none of us recognized. The air grew colder, heavier, as if the forest itself was warning us to turn back. That night, the terror escalated. We set up camp near an abandoned shelter we found along the trail, its wooden frame weathered and crumbling. It felt wrong being there, but the sun was setting, and we had little choice. As darkness fell, the noises started again. But this time, they weren't just footsteps. Low murmurs floated through the air, unintelligible but filled with malice. The fire flickered wildly, as if some unseen force was trying to extinguish it. And then we saw it. A figure standing just beyond the tree line, barely illuminated by the fire's glow. It was tall and gaunt, its face obscured by the shadows. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, watching. We froze, unsure whether to run or confront it. One of my friends, Alex, shouted into the darkness, "Who's there?" No response. The figure simply melted into the shadows, as if it had never been there at all. Panic set in. We debated packing up and hiking back in the dark, but the thought of walking through the forest with whatever was out there made my skin crawl. We decided to stay put, taking turns keeping watch. When it was my shift, the fire was nearly out, and the forest was impossibly dark. My flashlight barely penetrated the inky blackness. I kept my eyes glued to the tree line, every rustle of leaves sending my heart racing. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. The figure was back, closer this time. Its features were still obscured, but its presence was suffocating. My hand shook as I raised the flashlight, the beam landing on where it should have been, but there was nothing there. A cold, bony hand clamped down on my shoulder. I spun around, screaming, but no one was there. My friends woke up in a panic, and I tried to explain what had happened, but my words were a jumbled mess. They didn't believe me, or maybe they didn't want to. The rest of the night was a blur of terror and sleeplessness. By morning, we were all on edge, the cheerful camaraderie of the first day completely gone. We packed up and decided to cut the trip short, heading back toward the trailhead. But the forest wasn't done with us. The path seemed to twist and turn in ways it hadn't before, leading us deeper instead of out. The symbols on the trees became more frequent, more ominous. The whispers followed us, growing louder, more insistent. Leave, leave, leave. And then we saw it, a clearing filled with dozens of those same symbols, carved into the ground, the trees, even stones. In the center stood a decayed wooden effigy, its twisted form almost human, but not quite. The air was thick with the stench of rot and something else, something ancient and malevolent. We ran. It didn't matter where, as long as it was away from that place. The whispers turned to screams, the forest coming alive with shadows that clawed at us, branches that seemed to reach out to grab us. When we finally stumbled onto the trailhead, gasping for air and trembling with fear, the whispers stopped. The forest returned to its usual stillness, as if nothing had happened. But I know the truth. Something lives in those woods, something older than the trail, older than the trees. It doesn't want visitors, and if you don't heed its warnings, it won't let you leave.